To understand the mechanics of New Zealand's latest fiscal targets, we have to look closely at the executive choices driving Budget 2026. On the state side, the operating package is tightened to $2.1 billion to counter inflation, extreme weather, and global instability. The goal is a surplus by 2028-29. But on the localized household ledger, metrics like youth unemployment have already climbed to 15%. Achieving state-level surplus requires a mechanical trade-off. By capping its own spending, the government is transferring financial friction directly onto localized households. Finance Minister Nicola Willis and Prime Minister Christopher Luxon present the budget as a map of responsible choices necessary for economic security. Hitting their surplus target requires extracting exactly $1.7 billion in savings and revenue measures from the current system. The political opposition, led by Chris Hipkins and finance spokesperson Barbara Edmonds, argues that these calculations ignore the immediate human cost of fiscal restraint. Advocacy groups and unions share this stance, pointing out that improving the national balance sheet does little for families currently struggling with the cost of food, rent, and fuel. To measure the true impact of Budget 2026, we must look past the political framing of both sides and strictly track the reallocation of capital. Generating that $1.7 billion in savings requires an intentional contraction of state capacity. This scale visualizes the exact dimensions of the cuts. The government is removing $2.4 billion from department budgets and eliminating 9,000 public service roles. These roles represent functional systems. The cuts absorb positions responsible for processing superannuation, reviewing benefit applications, and maintaining border protection. The workforce response is sharp. The Public Service Association calculates that 1 in 7 state workers could face job losses under this financial pressure. With capital stripped from civil administration, we have to track where the money is being injected: macroeconomic and physical security infrastructure. The budget redirects $1.1 billion of operating funding into law and order, specifically securing $50 million for frontline policing alone. The physical security pivot includes significant defense hardware investments. This funds capability extensions for Anzac-class frigates and HMNZS Canterbury to harden military logistics. Peace campaigners argue this reallocation prioritizes military capability over the underlying social well-being and climate resilience of the population. The budget redefines the parameters of national security. It actively trades civil administrative capacity for physical infrastructure and defense readiness. Moving from national defense economics, we can map how this fiscal discipline hits the mathematics of household survival. This data table tracks the localized impact. Looking at the policy changes for social housing, we see a direct transfer of cost. Tenant contributions are shifting upward, increasing from 25% to 30% of an individual's income. Scaling that percentage shift to the population means roughly 84,000 households face an average cost increase of $31 per week. The second major reduction isolates temporary additional support payments. Shrinking maximum payouts removes $196 million from the household ledger. The government's rationale is that this support should act as a temporary last resort payment, allowing the state to rebalance support while remaining fiscally neutral. But state-level neutrality contrasts sharply with localized reality. Families are absorbing these reductions while already compressed by high rent, fuel, and food costs. Maori readership points out the flaw, arguing the budget manages symptoms of inequality rather than investing in the healthcare and housing needed to cure it. The state achieves surplus targets by lowering the financial safety net. The mathematical burden of balancing the books lands heavily on the lowest income renters. This structural pivot extends into the tertiary sector, where the traditional university funding model is facing a severe reallocation. This flow map shows the most definitive educational shift in the budget, the complete termination of the broad-based fees-free tertiary scheme. The government relies on this data for its rationale. The universal subsidy failed to improve student completion rates or effectively target low-income individuals. Instead of broad subsidies, the redirected capital is injected directly into specialized vocational pathways. Looking at the exact metrics, Trades Academy places for senior high school students are doubling, jumping from 10,000 to 20,000 funded spots. An additional 1,000 youth guarantee places are being added, specifically targeting school leavers holding 0 qualifications. ACT seat leader David Seymour claims this as proof of his party's influence, cutting broadly targeted programs to push spending toward frontline, pragmatic services. The state is abandoning universal academic subsidization, opting instead for immediate, targeted workforce alignment. To view the full context of the ledger, we have to acknowledge the single largest expenditure in the budget: health. This dashboard scales the health funding appropriately. The government is allocating $34 billion in total, injecting $5.5 billion in additional funding directly into frontline services and specialist assessments. Yet unions point out a structural flaw. Even with billions allocated, the resources are skewed heavily toward treating people after they reach a crisis point, rather than funding early, community-level primary care. Pulling back to evaluate the entire budgetary data model, the mechanics of the trade-off become clear. The macroeconomic execution is mathematically precise. The government has engineered a direct path to a 2028 surplus, while heavily fortifying defense and national infrastructure against external shocks. The cost of that state-level security is a dramatically leaner public service and the total removal of broad educational subsidies. The ultimate financial friction lands at the bottom of the economic ladder. Low-income households and social renters are left absorbing increased out-of-pocket living expenses. This sets the central tension for the election year. A nation is securing its balance sheet against global economic shocks by directly reducing the capacity of its most vulnerable citizens to survive domestic ones. The ultimate legacy of Budget 2026 will not be decided by Treasury forecasts or political speeches. It will be decided by whether the average family can actually afford the cost of the government's discipline.